It is a country of nearly 1.5 billion people, the most populated nation on the planet. It represents the world's 5th largest economy, and just recently has landed a rover near the South Pole of the Moon. Yet it almost never features among Europe's strategic priorities. So, did the EU forget about India? Good evening. My name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. From a basic European perspective, China and Russia are the obvious threats to the liberal international order. But while they are most certainly no friends of the West, there is another country that represents a gigantic opportunity for Brussels. India has experienced remarkable economic growth over the last decade, and at least from an economic point of view, it is already a global giant. But in recent years, the country has also begun to display significant ambitions in foreign policy, aspiring to become the main gateway to the global south. It has managed to forge a unique position, balancing connections with the West, Russia, and developing states. So given all that, what does the EU have to offer to Narendra Modi? We examine this topic in our first report.
2024 has been labeled the global year of elections. Over 3 billion people have already gone to the polls, but no ballot so far has attracted as much attention as the one in India. It's the largest democracy in the world, with voting stretched out over a span of 6 weeks. But even before this year's election began, concerns were already raised about the state of India's democracy. For years, the incumbent Narendra Modi has been pushing a Hindu nationalist agenda. In his decade in power, he weakened the position of religious minorities, primarily targeting the country's Muslim citizens. He stripped the disputed majority Muslim region of Kashmir of its special semi-autonomous status.
In the overall country, there is a sense of insecurity in the minorities, and I guess the same is happening in Kashmir as well. So I think the state of affairs in Kashmir is very worrisome these days because we have been denied democracy from last 10 years.
In 2019, India's government introduced a scheme to fast-track the neutralization of Hindu refugees from neighboring countries. Muslims were explicitly excluded from the program. Finally this year, Modi dangerously blurred the lines between political and religious authority. He personally blessed a new Hindu temple in Ayodhya, erected on the site of an ancient mosque. Yet, economically, India under Modi has been a success story. It's maintained a steady 5% annual GDP growth, interrupted only by the COVID pandemic. It surpassed Great Britain to become the world's 5th largest economy. A number of global manufacturing giants, including Apple, Siemens, and Honda, have relocated much of their capacity to the subcontinent. With Russia out of the picture and China seen as a threat, India just might be the solution to many of the West's problems.
How long will India be able to ride its wave of success despite the many internal contradictions? How could Europe join in? And is Narendra Modi even remotely interested in an equal partnership with Brussels? We will try to shed some light on all of these topics with the help of our experts. Joining me tonight are Alberto Rizzi, Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Shibani Mehta, Senior Research Analyst at Carnegie India, and James Crabtree, Distinguished Visiting Fellow, also at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Good evening and welcome to Wider View. James, I want to begin with you straight away and ask you to provide us with a sense of India's self-perception or self-identification. It is the most populous country on the planet. It is the world's 5th largest economy. By all means, it is a very heavyweight player in international affairs. Does India actually consider itself a global superpower in the full meaning of that term?
Not quite yet. India has described itself as a rising power. It's more powerful than it used to be. It expects to become more powerful It has a powerful and prominent leader in Narendra Modi, and it has the fastest growing economy in the world, which attracts a lot of attention. But it also feels insecure. It's very worried about the rise of China, where it nearly fought a military conflict across the Himalayas a couple of years ago. China is making incursions into South Asia, and therefore it is seeking to balance its traditional relations with Russia, which have been strong, with new relations with the United States, with countries like Japan and South Korea in Asia, and with Europe. And so India is developing a new foreign policy to respond to its own rising power, but also the rising power of China.
So you touched upon a very important issue here, James, and on that note, I want to introduce Shibani into our conversation and ask you specifically, Shibani, about China. How important a point of reference is Beijing for India? Because undoubtedly, surpassing China in population growth, having some of the tech giants relocating their manufacturing from China to India, that must have been an enormous boost for popularity for Narendra Modi. How important is that rivalry still in Indian politics?
Well, it's important to understand that we can't simply classify the India-China relationship as a rivalry. It's incredibly complex, where you have a mix of a rivalry, a cooperation, and I would say to some degree, cautious engagement. And to understand this relationship, we need to look at multiple dimensions, whether it's the historical context. India and China have fought a war in 1962 that was considered a humiliating defeat for India. Geopolitically, India and China competing in South Asia with sort of in India's neighborhood, that becomes a dimension to focus on. Of course, there's the economic side of their relationship. The trade relationship China is a very important trading partner for India, but also sees that the conditions for trade are unfavorable for India itself. So while it is an important point of discussion in Indian foreign politics, I think to classify simply as a rivalry would be unfair.
Well, that is certainly a very complex picture, and I think we're going to make it even more complex right now when I bring Alberto into our discussion and ask you about the European perspective in things. Because here on our show, we have devoted ample space to Russia, China, even the Middle East, but India seems to be very rarely featuring in discussions over EU's strategic priorities. Is this a correct reading, that Europe doesn't really look towards India with much importance, would you say? Or how does Brussels actually see India? A partner, a competitor, a forgotten player?
I would say that probably there has been a lot of things happening that prevented Europe from placing India that high in the list of the priorities, but it is clearly of growing importance. And I would say that Europe looks at India from three different perspectives. The first one is that it sees India as a growing trade partner and as a big economic opportunity in the future. It sees it also as a component in its de-risking strategy from China, because if you want to rely less on China, India comes into the play as a potential, not really alternative, but definitely an additional option. And that encompasses as an export market, manufacturing opportunities, but also import of goods and other raw materials. And finally, it sees India as a sort of strategic gateway to reach out to the global south and the set of developing countries that Europe is very keen on mending ties with, especially after the pandemic, the global competition with China and the war in Ukraine.
So a quick follow-up question to you, Alberto, because you mentioned India playing the role of the gateway to the global south. We're going to talk about that further in our discussion. How much is Europe actually taking advantage of the fact that India can facilitate connections in the global south?
Quite significantly, and Europe really wants to leverage this Indian quest for global South leadership, which is openly declared by India as an ambition to be the voice of the global South. And here Europe sees a strategic opportunity relying on India to improve its relationship with the whole set of developing countries that are not part of the West.
James, back to you, and it seems to be the case that we're talking about perceptions all the time. In the West, Modi has very often been criticized for populist nationalist policies, violation of the rights of minorities, as we've presented in our opening material. How is he perceived at home? Is he seen as the sole author of the economic boom, a person that gave a lot of wealth personally to Indians, or is he a very contradictory person, or perhaps a violator of human rights, in fact?
I mean, Narendra Modi, since he was elected in 2014, has been an astonishingly popular politician. He won 2 huge landslide majorities, and recently won a third election, albeit not quite as resoundingly. So he now governs as part of a fairly stable coalition with a couple of minority partners. But I think it would be fair to say, he's viewed as a strong leader. He is broadly popular with the Indian people. And he's particularly popular with his own Hindu nationalist supporters. I think the people who worry about Narendra Modi were India's minorities, particularly its Muslim minorities, of whom there are more than 200 million, and Indian liberals, perhaps in the European sense, who worried that the direction that Mr. Modi's party would take the country in would be to remove a lot of its secular non-religious history. That threat has slightly receded with the election result, given he no longer is in overall control. But I think it would be fair to say that he is still seen as a strong and popular leader.
We're going to pause our discussion here for a second because we talked extensively about how India is viewed from other places in the world. But looking from New Delhi, the world might have a slightly different makeup. So let's explore that perspective now in the second part of our discussion. One of Narendra Modi's main priorities has been to increase India's influence on the world stage. As a perennial rival of China, a founding member of BRICS, and an ally of the United States, but also a key trading partner of Russia, it really faces a unique set of challenges and opportunities. Our next report explains what India wants to achieve in global diplomacy and how it intends to get there.
In January 2023, India's Foreign Ministry launched the Voice of Global South Summit initiative. The brand new diplomatic format gathered delegations from over 120 countries in the subcontinent, most of them from the Global South. They met to discuss their underrepresentation vis-à-vis Europe and the US. Since then, 2 more editions of the summit have taken place, each garnering enormous interest in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This initiative is a testament to what Narendra Modi wants India to become, a diplomatic powerhouse in its own right. Taking advantage of its critical strategic location and open channels with enemies of the West, he has a strong hand to play. India aspires to become not just a bridge to emerging economies, but their advocate as well. It played a key role in extending the invitation for the African Union to join the G20. In fact, the intention was announced during the organization's conference in New Delhi last year. Modi's government has also increased its pull inside BRICS, acting as a counterbalance to Chinese ambitions. Together with Brazil, it shot down Xi Jinping's efforts to establish the yuan as the group's trading currency. At the same time, Modi recognizes his role as Washington's key ally in the region. Under his watch, India rejoined the Quad initiative aimed at deterring China militarily. And yet, India remains the second largest importer of Russian coal and crude oil. Its foreign policy is a real balancing act, but so far, Modi has managed to stand firmly on both legs.
Shibani, on the basis of what we've just seen, what is Narendra Modi after in foreign policy? What is his end game? Is it the permanent seat on the United Nations reformed Security Council? Is it being the sole gateway to the Global South? Is it being a counterbalance to China? Or is it all of those things at once?
I would like to say it's a combination of all of those things. I think, as James was saying earlier, India identifies as a rising, so it doesn't consider itself in the same league as the US or the EU, for that matter, when it comes to economic power or military power. But it does want to be a diplomatic heavyweight that is a responsible stakeholder in in the world. What the Modi government is aspiring to do is to elevate India's global status while also advocating for developing nations. And this is evident from the fact that Prime Minister Modi is leveraging formats like the G20 and the Global Voices Summit. He's talking about India's growing capabilities and thought leadership. At the same time, there is simultaneous participation in BRICS as well as Quad, which demonstrate a more pragmatic approach. So it's not really about a balancing act, but more about maximizing India's strategic options. Through BRICS, India engages with emerging economies, whereas with the Quad, India aligns itself with democratic powers in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, one person's strategic approach is another person's contradiction, perhaps. And on that note, I wanted to ask you, Alberto, Frank, a straightforward question, I think, from a European perspective. Why did India decide to sit on the fence in the Ukrainian conflict against Russia? What's in it for Modi not to condemn Vladimir Putin and his aggression on the Ukrainian soil?
Well, a lot of it could be explained by the significant ties that Russia and India had even before the war in terms of energy engagement, especially on fossil fuels and nuclear technology, in terms of the way India looks at Russia to balance the relationship with China as a sort of a triangle with Russia. India's trying to reinforce its relationship with Russia in order to contain China, but also because of long-standing legacy in terms of defense ties as well. So it's a complicated alignment that limited in a certain way the choices for India. But I would say that the perception is somehow shifting recently. We've seen in the video the bear hug between Modi and Putin, but later Modi visited Ukraine, and the position of India towards this conflict is slowly, probably, but is mutating.
Well, on that note, I wanted to turn to you, James, and ask a question about India and the West, but from a slightly different perspective. How does India view the West? Because we often hear from diplomats from countries like India, not just India, that the rules-based liberal order is collapsing, that the West is a hypocritical actor, and there's no reason for them to engage in any of the moral high ground arguments that Washington and Brussels are projecting, because that system has been violated many times before, and there's no reason for them to follow those rules anymore. Is West a very important point of reference for India?
So I think it's true to say that Indian leaders are very, perhaps understandably, sensitive to the accusation that they're being lectured to by the West. So the Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, often will accuse Europeans of double standards, particularly over Ukraine, as in the Europeans expect everyone, including India, to come riding to the rescue on issues which concern them, but then don't act in the same way in different issues which might concern India. So yes, there is often the accusation that Europeans and the West in general is hypocritical, operates on double standards, and that kind of thing. But I think the bigger picture, again, I go back to what I said earlier, the primary change in Indian foreign policy over the last 10 years is the enormous increase in concern about the threat emanating from China. And India has two ways to respond to that. One is it builds up its own strength, its economic strength and its military strength, but that takes time. And China is already a military stronger and economically larger power. Therefore, India's only real option is to draw closer to the other countries that are concerned about the rise of China, almost all of which are Western. And the United States is the most important. Japan and Australia and South Korea in Asia are the closest, and then Europe is the third grouping. And that's exactly what India has done. So that doesn't mean it's going to give up on its traditional relationship with Russia, which still matters for energy imports and weapons. But it does mean that more of the energy of Indian foreign policy is going into building relations with the West. And that's, I think, the most important point for your audience to remember.
So on the last note, I actually wanted to follow up a little bit and ask you about the limits of that possible relationship between India and Russia, because a lot of Western leaders, Western diplomats, seem to be able to turn a blind eye to a lot of things that are happening in India precisely because of the fact that India remains a strategic ally, especially for the United States, militarily, strategically in the region. But how long do you think Modi will be allowed to pursue that trade relationship, for instance, with Russia, and the West will continue to tolerate that? Are there limits to that engagement?
I think there are limits to the West's sort of tolerance for India's foreign policy. I wouldn't pick Ukraine in particular as one. The thing I think that's more interesting is India was recently found to have assassinated a Sikh separatist in Canada and attempted through a proxy to assassinate a Sikh separatist in the United States. I think if India continues to behave in that way, as in breaking quite clear international norms, then that would carry consequences. But I think, in a sense, the West is playing a bigger game here. They recognize that being friendly with India is very important given the big picture geostrategic competition with China, which is what really matters to Washington and Japan and Australia, and to a lesser degree in Europe. And therefore, there's a degree of understanding that India has this heritage relationship with Russia. It's not expanding it, but it's not degrading it. It does need Russian weapons, in particular, because it might need it if it were to ever fight a war against China. And it is going to buy cheap Russian oil if it's offered it. But I think people are not going to, in a sense, punish India for that, because there's a bigger game to play, and that bigger game is the balance against China.
So a very quick follow-up question. You've mentioned a possible escalation with China or any other regional superpower. Do you think that any of the conflicts that India is engaged in, be it Pakistan or China, do have a potential to go beyond the stage that they're in right now?
Yes, both of them, clearly do. I'm not saying that it's imminent, but India and China came very close to fighting a military conflict only 3 years ago in the Himalayas. So the circumstances in which that would happen would probably involve some sort of accidental spark that then got out of control. But yes, I think it's clear that there is a risk that these two Asian giants, both of whom have nuclear weapons, could accidentally stumble into a military conflict. Not impossible. It's not very likely, but it's definitely not impossible. I also think that India might face some hard choices in other parts of Asia, as in, I don't think it's very likely that India would support actively the United States if there was a conflict over Taiwan, for instance. But India increasingly sees the status of East Asia, namely Taiwan, as part of its own security interests. So it's watching that part of the world and the balance of power in Asia with increased attention.
Well, we will definitely keep an eye on the balance of power in Southeast Asia, and also a close eye on the developments in India. I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. Alberto, Rizzi, Shibani, Mehta, and James Crabtree were our guests tonight. Thank you very much. India's role in the global economy and diplomacy will only increase, at least in the coming years. Some of Narendra Modi's decisions might raise eyebrows in Brussels. There's no question about that. But sometimes actors in international politics don't have enemies or friends, just interests. So maybe it's high time for the EU to rethink how much attention it has devoted and how much it should devote to India. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we'll bring you another special episode of Wider View, a conversation with former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Make sure you're with us next Thursday, and have a good evening.